Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the critical role of workload automation in achieving successful digital transformation. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Our featured speaker is Dan Twing, President and COO at Enterprise Management Associates. Dan joined EMA in 2005 and has over 25 years of experience in information systems, software development, and technology outsourcing. Dan focuses on all aspects of intelligent and automated management of IT. And before I hand things over to Dan, I wanted today's audience to know that Dan will be concluding his presentation by taking your questions. Feel free to log them anytime by using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA with the on-demand playback. So I hope you'll check that email out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, Dan Twing. Dan?
Thanks, Raleigh. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to be talking today about the research that we recently did. I want to start by thanking our sponsors for being part of making this possible. Sponsors were BMC, Broadcom, Infinite Data, and Redwood. So before I get into some of the ground level setting for the research and the demographics, I just wanted to open with this. As I looked at this research, we were really focused on, as you know, the title is the transformation of workload automation, sort of the theme here, which it's been adapting and changing as if you followed any of my other research and webinars, we've been watching this for a while. But as I sat down with this data, it really just struck me how much change these organizations are struggling with as they consider new workload tools and other changes. So, you know, we are all aware of the rapid technological advancements, the consumer expectations changing, the whole remote work shift, which was really happening ahead of the pandemic, but really came into focus for a lot of us then. And many still are working in that remote form. And of course, all of the automation and digital transformation that's going on. So with that as a backdrop, it's really creating a lot of transformation across the industry. We're seeing a lot of, you know, application modernization, mainframe modernization, a lot of push to the cloud. So that's really was the backdrop to looking at how is workload changing in reaction to that. Real quick, just so you know where this data came from, we did a 406 end survey globally. I'll cover the regions here in a second. From a person perspective, an individual respondent perspective, we had a lot of IT execs, quite a lot of security in this one. Service management folks, ops folks, business execs, you can see that. Just in terms of their roles, the bulk of it, almost 50% are managers or directors. We've got about 20% that are VPs, CXO types, handful of team leaders and some individual contributors in the mix here. This was global. We split it about 40% Asia, which was made up of India, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. Pretty much matches the data I had collected in 2021, and I will refer to some trends that look back to multiple years. Most of those will look back just to 2021 and now, I'm sorry, 2020. So these same demographics are similar to that prior study when we compare data. About 30% was Europe, made up of Germany, France, and the UK, and North America, 30% represented by the United States. In terms of organization sizes, it's a pretty common mix for what I've done in the past. Lots of big, lots of middle size. We didn't look at anyone below 500 employees. From a revenue perspective, it does, you know, sort of span it, but it tends to lean to the larger organization size. And then in terms of industries, when I wasn't doing Asia, we didn't get nearly the amount of manufacturing that we get now. So, you know, historically, finance and banking would be near the top, but as we've brought Asia into these surveys in the last, I think the last two that I did prior to this one also had an Asian mix to it. And what happens then is we see technology and manufacturing rise up a bit in that. But still, you know, the top four are banking, high tech, manufacturing, and retail. So let's get on to the data. And the big headline for me is this first data point here. As I was trying to assess how I would think about how workload has changed in response to digital transformation, it occurred to me that, you know, we've been talking about this topic for a long time as an industry. When I actually went back and looked, it's been almost 11 years ago that the first reference to a digitally transformed organization. It was, I'm forgetting the actual quote now. It's in the report if you've seen it, but it was one of the big consulting firms that wrote a paper about digitally transforming organizations, and that was almost 11 years ago. So, you know, we've been using this in marketing and as a hot topic, and organizations surely have been putting resources behind doing it. But I hadn't really seen a measure of how we've been, as an industry, achieving that. So I conceived this question just to give me that backdrop. And this turned out to be a really great data point that I will reference multiple times as we go through this. But the first big takeaway is, you know, I just kind of came up with, I think there's what, 8 or 10 categories here. It's a little more detailed than a typical survey question, just to say, where are you at in your journey for digital transformation? And 97% of the organizations we surveyed are on that journey. Only 3% said we have no activities. And I was really just trying to assess where they were. And so it sort of started with modernizing applications, which is a big precursor. And we've been seeing that in our surveys for the last couple of years as a driver for folks to think about getting a different workload tool if the one they have isn't really supporting what they want to do as they modernize their infrastructure and modernize their applications. So are you at that stage getting ready? Are you planning it? You know, are you actually in the early stages of beginning to think about building the tools? Maybe you've got some prototyping going on. 2, I've got one project or maybe multiple projects running. I'm in the green section now. First digital transformation project is complete. We have more underway. We've got multiple projects done, but we're still developing others. I mean, you know, an organization could live at this stage for quite a number of years if they're actively working through a large number of transform processes. Then we move into the blue section, which is, you know, everything we planned is done. We're not sure we're finished, but, you know, we're contemplating what might come next. That was the first one that I deemed mature. And then the digital transformation is fully implemented. So, yep, we're kind of on pause. We got everything. We revisited it. We're done. And I threw this on here because I'm sure for many, they're in there thinking about what is the next generation or the next phase. I mean, really, this phase of digital transformation is far from the first. You think about when mobile apps started coming out, you know, we've been doing that game for a decade now. You know, that was really round one, but it was kind of bolted on top of the infrastructure. So, you know, this time around, it's really changing the infrastructure. But I'm sure that some of the early adopters are already thinking about where they're going next. And as you can see, 4% said that's where I'm at. I'm now thinking about what's the next generation. And of course, the recent popularity of large language models and ChatGPT and the like, the AI aspects probably are going to be driving a lot of what's going to be in that Gen 2. But then I summarized that down by that color coding to just 5 categories. So I have none, I'm early, I'm underway, I'm mature, or I'm in stage 2. And when we look at it through that lens, you can see that 77% of the market is still working through this, either the 40% that's early or the 37% that's underway. And really only 21% would self-describe as mature with their digital transformation. And I thought this was really a great, you know, checkpoint on where we're at in this transformation. And really, this is just this round. Like I said, there's really no endpoint, right? Then it's a journey. Some 4% are already starting the next journey, while 3% haven't even begun this journey, right? And everyone else is in the middle there somewhere. When I ask, is digital transformation is requiring more from our scheduling and workload automation solution, this data really, for me, jumps off the page. And there's several more points like this through the course of looking at these research results. But clearly, the ones who have the most mature digital transformation are more likely to agree or strongly agree that they're asking more of their automation and scheduling systems in support of all of this digital transformation. I mean, if you look at, the purple line is the strongly agree, the blue line is the agree, and you can see how it's just absolutely tilting towards, if the farther I am through my process of digital transformation, the more I'm leaning on these tools. So this question was asked to, understand what then is the kinds of support that are being provided in support of digital transformation. How does workload really play in that arena? So these were the responses that made sense to me that we gave them, and there's also a write-in for other, but honestly, I think we had captured it here, sorted by most common. So 51% actually are using WLA in support of their digital transformation because of its support for DevOps processes, for increasing development speed, and then configuration management, the next two, 50% for cloud infrastructure and 45% for on-prem infrastructure. So certainly this has been a trend for a while that we've seen workload get more and more involved in configuration as more things have gone to serverless or software defined or whatever your favorite latest term is, cloud native, whatever you want to describe that as that capability has grown, workload has stepped right up to automate a lot of that. And it helps developers because, and the development process, because it's supportive of creating that config in test and dev, dev first and then in test and then in production. And while, the scale is getting bigger and things are changing and the security is different and the networking is different, a lot of the configuration and the things that are necessary to stand up a new release or a new application are sorted out in dev and carried forward in a way that is automated. And that's very helpful. The other big aspect of digital transformation is we all have seen the explosion of data and data pipelines. Well, managed file transfer capabilities in workload is a big support function around digital transformation. And you can see for 39%, they felt like that was part of their support of their digital transformation journey. Then we move into, of course, there's release management as well, which 28% are using their workload tool to assist with release management as well. These last few is really where my interest lies, and this is less of a massive trend, but I think it will continue to grow, which is actually displacing some developer work or some coding, or otherwise leveraging either integrations to other parts of the infrastructure or pathways for dashboarding to end users to have status on processes that matter to them. All of these things are things that don't necessarily have to be built into a new digital transform process. And while we're only seeing, 27% are sort of at that point where, I am using WLA for end-to-end orchestration of one or more digital processes, or up above a little ways, 33% who are saying, it helps me connect two different digital transform processes. So maybe it's just taking data from one process and getting it to the other process. Whereas in other cases, it could actually be handling, steps within a process that don't have to be built into the app because it's more efficient to lean on the workload automation tool to handle some functions. I think this is where things are going to grow even larger as we go on. And I think that this is somewhat of the key as to why some of these folks who lean heavily on their workload tool are the ones who are also further along in their digital transformation. But beyond digital transformation, cloud is another big factor right now. And we've been covering cloud for a while in these surveys, but this time I sort of stepped back and really thought about, there's a really interesting interwoven and complex relationship between workload automation and cloud. First of all, it supports the infrastructure. We just saw, that a large number of folks are using it to manage their cloud infrastructure. It's also supportive of cloud-based applications, both to handle any of the scheduling activities around them and moving data around them. WA supports legacy workloads that are moving to the cloud as well. And you can host workload in the cloud. And as an offshoot of that, we are seeing a growth in software as a service. So there's a lot of relationships that workload has with cloud computing. First, if we just look at what organizations are using from the cloud and how that's growing and changing, in 2020 is the green bar, 2023 the blue bar, so you can kind of see the trends. Cloud storage still is sort of the top, one of the top line items of how folks are leveraging cloud. Office productivity tools, whether it's Google Sheets or Microsoft Office 365. Another big area, although that seems to have taken a step back quite a bit from 2020. I think a lot of organizations might have moved there and then decided that they wanted elsewhere. CRM is another area where we see and support kinds of products. A lot of those being SaaS-based, but they're also, a big user in cloud. We didn't ask about cloud ERP in 2020, but we did this year, and you can see it's already a big number. And then, as we move into compute and networking and communications and other sorts of data processing, still you've got, in the case of compute now 50% of the market, we crossed over that 50% line, have some compute running in the cloud and the comms that go with it. And then of course, some of those collaboration kinds of tools. And we know workload, of course, is growing the integration with those kinds of tools as well, because a lot of the alerting and statusing goes down that pathway. And then the very specific sort of data processing kinds of specific tools. So organizations are leaning on cloud, and in almost every case that has grown since then. We saw a step back in office productivity, and data is about where it was. So if we ask the next question, which of these cloud services that you're using are supported by your workload automation environment? And as you would expect, in many cases, for most organizations, it's extensive or moderate support for every one of those. For some, it's minimal or not supported, but those numbers are relatively small, and they're probably not very sophisticated in their use of those tools. But you can see, especially cloud, the extensive support. If you remember from the slide before, cloud storage didn't change that much. I'll flip back there real quick. It was, statistically the same number, but you can see that workload is way more engaged than it was in 2020. So in the last 2.5 years, we've seen a lot more data handling, data pipelines come into play. And what's emerged, and I actually have a data point on this later in the slide, but when you start having all these cloud environments, and we know multi-cloud is where most organizations are, they'll do different things in Azure or AWS. They might have something in Oracle Cloud or SAP Cloud. The cloud storage is, and that pipeline management is a big part of this. And then right behind that is the data processing types of things, the Hadoop, the Databricks, that kind of stuff. And cloud ERP, very, very strong already. So you can see, workload is absolutely involved in all of that. Then we asked, how important are each of the following to your cloud operations. And this is another kind of take or view on how workload automation could be supportive of cloud. So that here again is that cloud infrastructure aspect. And here we're at, I'm showing you just those that answered extremely or very important on a 5-point scale. And 78% said extremely or very important, the cloud infrastructure automation. Hybrid cloud data transfer. This is another aspect of all these environments. Now you start moving data, not just, from on-prem to clients, but on-prem to cloud, back to on-prem, maybe to 3 other different cloud environments. If you're in multi-cloud, there's just a whole lot more data moving work going on, in part because there's a lot more data. But even if the data were the same, we now have so many different environments that we have to move the data in between and amongst. There's a lot of activity there. Simplifying cloud migrations, workload and automation certainly is helpful there. Orchestration and observability, orchestrating multiple clouds, that multi-cloud data transfer aspect, different than the hybrid cloud data transfer, and then supporting containers and microservices. Workload is absolutely key to, running these multi-cloud environments. And then we looked at, actually lifting and moving legacy production workloads to the cloud. And I have continued to make this distinction. I think about early cloud stuff was a lot of the cool born in the cloud bolt-on things that then had to somehow be stitched into the legacy infrastructure. And a lot of stuff wasn't moving, the core legacy things weren't going up to the cloud unless an organization had a very specific objective to move to cloud, which we really didn't see a lot of until about 2020. The pandemic really seemed to force a lot of folks to rethink that. And that really was put on the fast track for many organizations who are now in a 5 or 7 year planning time horizon to actually achieve eliminating, in some cases, their entire on-prem aspects. Many say we probably won't get there, but that's the goal. And they're saying 5 years or 7 years, it could take 10. But there is a significant push in that direction now. And you can see here that, why might you push there? It really all boils down to scalability, reliability, and provisioning speed is the top reasons, both for why they might use a private or public cloud to run scheduled jobs, and also how they're using private and public cloud resources, whether that be for, additional capacity, permanent production jobs. You can see the trends. I mean, there's some of the ad hoc and the bursting things are actually starting to grow a bit, pretty flat on what's being used, so sort of for bursting and peak productivity. But we'll see, more and more of this stuff move up. And right now, we see 72% run production workloads in public and private cloud as their sole cloud type is really declining. So, many, we see here, 7% more, that is a statistically significant difference, have both private and public, but you can see private is declining while public is growing slightly. So I think that trend will continue. And when you look at the cloud providers, this is in no way a representation of market share. I mean, if you look at market share, Amazon is, I think, still on top pretty handily, even though as Azure grows and so do the others. This is really asking this group of respondents, where do you have things running? It's not reflective of their spend, and their spend would be how you would measure the market share in many cases, not just, usage. So we definitely see a lot of these folks have IBM Cloud and Azure, even more so than AWS. That this is, again, a lot of them might be using Azure for backups because it's easy if you're running some of the Microsoft tools, and they may use AWS for apps and other things. So again, not market share, just, where it's being used, and you can see they're using a lot of it. Predominantly the big public ones, and then IBM and Oracle. a trend within the scheduling space. There's, every environment tends to have its own environment scheduler. And even before cloud, we're all familiar with cron in a Linux environment, Windows Task Scheduler on Windows. IBM has a scheduler within ZOS, even though they also have their, big workload automation product. Most times the workload products will interact with those schedulers, but they add so much more to the party. And so it shouldn't really be a surprise that we see these environment-specific schedulers or function-specific schedulers that happen to, evolve around the cloud space. A really big, jump from when I did this data in the past. I don't have the trending data here, but Azure Logic Apps and AWS Batch, no surprise, they're near the top on this list because we saw those were the two most prominent public clouds. And then but what you also see here is a fair bit of churn. This is how many who are using it, but you see a pretty good number of those who previously used it and some that are evaluating. My experience with this is it tends to be somewhat transient. Developers will go off on a project. They'll reach for the easy scheduler in the environment they're in. Maybe they didn't even contemplate their scheduling needs till late in a project. And then they promote it to production, hand it off to operations, and perhaps later it gets converted into being orchestrated by the workload automation tool that operations prefers. But maybe that doesn't happen until the volumes start to climb, and over time they might move it. So you'll see them utilize these. Some might be permanent. I'll be interested to see how this shapes up as we do future surveys, and I will begin to trend this in the future. But I don't know that all of this is necessarily permanent, because the capabilities are so much more rich with the workload automation tools. And then we have, shifting into where is workload hosted. Still, private cloud is actually now the most common with this group of respondents that we did, and I think it's pretty reflective of the broader market. And I think it is showing additional growth that is just on the edge of statistically significant. So I think we are seeing a real increase in private cloud, and that is a real decline in on-premises. And so you can almost see how they're offsetting. And then public cloud platform as a service has increased, and public cloud infrastructure as a service has increased. So some of that on-prem is going to private, but a lot of it is moving more in the direction of public, either as infrastructure as a service or as platform as a service. And we're also seeing an increase in software as a service, still under 25% of the market, but that's a pretty significant jump in about 2.5 years to go from 18% on SaaS to about 23%. And the SaaS options have absolutely increased. Most of the major products now have some flavor of a managed capability. Some will tell you, you pick the cloud, we'll install it and manage it. So it's not maybe true SaaS in the most narrow definition of the word, but your experience is the same. You're paying either a subscription fee or some kind of activity-based fee, number of job executions or something. There's a variety of models out there, and it's in the public cloud. And as far as you're concerned, you're not involved in worrying about upgrades or whatnot. The fact that it isn't a true multi-tenant SaaS, it's really just hosted and serviced by the vendor who made the software, and you can tell them, I want mine in AWS, and the next client might want theirs in Google Cloud, and they're happy to support all of them. There's that model, and then there's the very narrow, traditional software as a service, multi-tenant type of thing. For example, both Redwood and with Run My Jobs and BMC with Control M operate that way. Infinite Data is also a sponsor of this research, and as is Broadcom. Infinite Data offers, you pick your cloud, and there are others who do the same. I know that Broadcom is also heading in that direction as well. So with that, SaaS is likely to grow. And you can see here that when I asked those who weren't already using SaaS, which was 314 of the 406, 92% of them said that they're very or somewhat likely to consider SaaS in the next 2 years. So while I don't know that we'll ever see 100% of the market on SaaS or even say 75%, I think we are going to see a rapid move towards the 50% mark over the next couple of years. And then, as we look at the group that said, yes, I'll probably be looking at SaaS in the next 2 years, and we compare that to the digital transformation maturity that we opened this presentation with. And when you really look at again, you see that high correlation. Those that are further down the digital transformation path are the ones who are most likely to be adding SaaS in the near term. They've modernized their infrastructure to go to digital transformation. They probably have built a lot of cloud-based stuff. As their transform processes have been delivered, they've probably been delivered with a lot of cloud involved. And once you do that, it makes a lot of sense for your workload to be in the cloud. And if it's going to be in the cloud, why not have it managed? I think this trend is definitely in part supportive of or being driven by digital transformation. It's certainly, there's a high correlation here. So with that backdrop and all of that change of technology, that's causing a lot of shifts as to how organizations think about workload automation and how they manage workload automation. So let's jump in here. We'll cover really how folks are looking at buying workload automation, how they're organizing their teams to manage it, the relationship with developers. A few years back, we saw the concept of code-driven or jobs as code capabilities to define scheduling parameters as kind of the beginning of how, and then the broader support for DevOps has really started to bring the developers closer to something that historically was a very operations-oriented software tool. And finally, you've all heard all of the talk about orchestration. I've used the term several times. WLA morphing into that automation orchestrator, or at least one of the key orchestrators of automation is the final topic here. And just in terms of thinking about how folks are changing their approach and attitudes. So first, I've asked for a number of years, and if you followed several of these webinars about my research in the past, you're well familiar with, who's changing their WA and who isn't was a big topic 5-6 years ago. That trend has continued and we're still looking at it. But I've also added an option for, we're adding a new one, but we're not changing the old one, because the pace of change is so quick, and all of this modernization in many organizations, they've moved away from the goal of having a single workload automation environment for the whole organization. And they've put in newer, modern, maybe whatever, something more specific to what their needs are for a new digital transformation project, or maybe they're bringing in a new ERP system and they want something, if you're going to S/4HANA and you want a more cloud-oriented tool that's very capable for SAP, you might deploy a new workload for that, but not move a lot of the other legacy work, the more traditional kinds of things. You might get to that later, but right now your focus is achieving either your digital transformation or your new ERP environment. And the pace of change is really forcing folks to move away from, I want to migrate to one tool for simplicity and that single, point of view and all of that, to that would be nice, but I just don't have the luxury of that. Time doesn't allow me that, and I'm going to add. And so you can see, 16% have no changes planned. For the most part, it's probably the bulk of those have already moved. There's probably 3 or 4 or 5% who just aren't in that more aggressive posture, and they have no changes because their legacy tool is sufficient. Then we have 23% who are actually driving towards new tools for new capabilities for a specific purpose and not swapping out the old. 45% are still attempting to standardize on a single tool. Maybe they don't have a need to bring in a special tool, or maybe they did a few years ago, and now it's matured to the point that they want to bring everything together again. And then there's 16% who are actively looking to just make a change. So a lot of activity here, but it's sort of shifting as a lot of the market has already made their choice for that next gen product. Although when we look at those that are in the mode of changing, or those that are in the mode of standardizing, you can see that those that are changing, the bulk of those are still are now in the Asian markets. We saw this trend in 2022, and it's gotten only stronger. We started to see the North American market and Europe markets move maybe 6 years ago, 8 years ago. You started to see an increase in those saying they were going to buy a new tool. So the trend really started, I think, in North America first, and then in Europe maybe a year or two later. And then several years after that, it started to heat up in the Asian market. Since they started later, they seem to be following a similar path. They just started several years later, so they're going to move through that process several years after the others, and that is how I interpret this data. But you also see a lot of other interesting aspects from the Asian space, the Asian markets. They have both the standardizing as well as adding for use cases. There's a lot of digital transformation activity there as well. So that is probably the market with the most churn, or the geography with the most churn in workload right now. Not that those trends are still playing out in both North America and Europe. They're just later in their life cycle. So there's more are already through it, and others are on their way through it. The result of all of that, I'm trying to summarize here, and looking at a trend line from 2019 to 2023 over that 4-year period. You can see that this trend of I'm going to add another product, with 25% of the market saying I'm just going to give up and add a product I need for this and not worry about being on one tool. The net effect of that is more organizations have multiple tools. So in 2019, 56% of the market had just one workload automation environment. And even back then, you might have multiples because of acquisitions, or you might have one division who has different needs and had a different tool. There's always been organizations with multiple tools, and that ebbs and flows over time. But by 2020, we saw only 50% had multiple or had a single tool. And in 2023, it's dropped a little further to 48.8%. And the offset to that is you can see that those with two tools has grown from 24 to 28%. And you've also see those with 4 or more has come up slightly as well. So, we should expect to see this. I would think that, you move ahead 4 or 5 years, as a lot of this change is absorbed, we might see this start moving back in the other direction. So here, what is driving folks to make changes? And this is data I've presented multiple times. There's not a lot of new headlines here, unless you're seeing the data for the first time, but a lot of the trends that we've been following, a lot of the reasons that people are shifting have remained pretty consistent. And when you look at what's causing the need to add or change, and these are only the top 6 responses. This question has a lot of other responses. I just narrowed in here on the first 6. Cloud-based jobs is the #1 driver to need a new tool. And right behind that is improving resource utilization, which, when you consider how much we have moving to the cloud, I think workload tools were pretty good at managing resource utilization, or helping you plan for running jobs where you can leverage the resources on the on-prem. I think a lot of that is being driven by, you go to the cloud and everything's going great until you're up there 6, 8, 9 months, and you're really running in full capacity now. Everything's going good, and then you start to see what your cloud bill looks like. And you start to think, maybe I need to utilize these resources more effectively. So I think some of the trend there is connected with the cloud-based jobs. But the digital transformation stuff is driving a lot of this, modernizing the apps, modernizing transformation. And then when you look at the ones they're choosing to quit, it's a little more traditional. It's cost. It's we're moving to a better tool, but we also have complexity in management and other things to digital transformation related. The next concept really is how are teams managed, and we have these decentralized teams that kind of are growing a bit. I've always thought about this as, traditionally, I'm fully centralized, right? I have one team, they are the only ones to lay hands on the tool. Currently, that's 26%. That's holding pretty flat. Then there's what I call the central control, which is I might have a core team setting naming standards and whatnot, but I have an explosion of users outside of that that are using the tool. We're not trying to control it centrally. We're trying to enable that self-service. That's growing from 2020. We had 33%, and now we're at 42%. So this is really emerging as sort of the new model. But transitionally, as you get there, and for some, it's more of a permanent state, they're in various forms of what I would call decentralized. I have one for my ERP. I don't try to standardize, or special projects get a special tool. So there's a mix of that going on, but there's a clear trend here to a central team coordinating and a lot of other users. And the final concept here is the thinking and how it's changing in regard to the developer teams. And is workload really becoming a tool that is broad, like DevOps is supposed to have both ops and dev in it? Well, as this is supporting DevOps, we're seeing it move in that direction. So really, a 5-point scale, I really just wanted to understand, do you think of it as your organization, is workload thought of just as the domain for ops? Is it mostly for ops? Maybe a few others care. Is it neutral? Do you really think it's ops and developers together? Or is it beyond that too? It's important, or it really just makes everybody more productive? You can see for 48% of the organizations, they're still in that traditional mindset of it's mostly an operations tool. 28% see it more in a neutral perspective. They realize it's important to both teams. And I would categorize those last two as being significantly more developer positive than the rest of the responses. And 24% of the market is now living in that mindset. I think this is going to continue to move in that direction. And here's another reason why. If we go back to the digital transformation maturity and compare that to the positive, how does dev approach workload? You can absolutely see, again, that high correlation. Those who have the most mature digital transformation are the ones who have their developers are most positive towards workload automation. Again, were they positive at the first place and that's why they got there quicker? Or did they struggle along the way and come to realize they needed automation and these tools to help them become more effective at their transformation? Don't know. We just know there's a correlation. I'll try to get some questions in the future that will help maybe figure that one out, but it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. The lesson here is if you're on your digital transformation journey and you don't have your developers awareness of workload and how it can help them be more effective, you probably want to think about that, because the ones who have succeeded, that's where they ended. Whether they started with that mindset or they developed that mindset over the course of the journey, they ended with that mindset. And I think that's a lesson for all of the rest of the market who's still on that journey. And then finally, at workload as an orchestrator, do you think that the workload automation tools should be further expanded to orchestrate more forms of automation across the enterprise? And again, we've seen strong support for this comment. It's 80–90%. But that high correlation, again, those who are more mature with digital transformation are the strongest voices on that concept. with that, I'm going to open it up for Q&A and let Raleigh help us get your questions fielded and answered.
Great. Thank you, Dan. The first question that came in is workload automation and SOAP, service orchestration and automation platform solution space, being considered the same thing in the context of this presentation? Or if different, what are the key differentiators?
That is an absolutely excellent question. It's not a simple yes or no answer, but the shortest answer is yes, they are substantially the same, but not all of the workload tools or all of the are moving in that direction. When Gartner first published the first SOAP paper, it was somewhat of a hot mess, in my opinion. They had some great workload tools in there. They had some great other tools in there, but it was kind of a mix of RPA, some other workflow things, and some workload tools. It didn't have definition. You know, their most recent work on that is really refined it more, and it's really starting to, you know, when I read the most recent one, it really started to look like it was more and more just those most modern, most aggressively advanced workload tools. They sort of weeded out some of the other things a bit, and those things are somewhat being subsumed in the orchestration role a bit more. Certainly, as I'm working on the radar report update for workload automation in 2023, which you'll see us publish in September timeframe, I've already got the data collection underway with the vendors. I've probably processed 8 or 10 of them so far, and you're absolutely seeing an increase in the number of RPA products being orchestrated amongst the various tool sets. So I think Gartner's original concept was on target. They started a bit broad, which is naturally where you might start, and they've narrowed it as the market has shifted and changed. But not every single workload tool is following that pathway. So I use orchestration more generally, or automation orchestration. I don't have the data in this survey, but I have been asking in the last 2 or 3 surveys I've done, you know, what do you think the new name should be? I just didn't include that here. It is actually in the published report if you choose to go read it. But SOAP has only been testing out at about 16% of the market who think that's the new name or should be. My own horse in that race, which I don't use yet because it's not doing much better, is enterprise automation orchestration is really a term I think might be more appropriate. Doesn't focus as much on the app support side of it. It really just focuses on the broader orchestration aspect. But that tests out about 14–16% as well. Gartner stopped using job scheduling in 2005 and first coined workload automation then. Job scheduling still today tests better than SOAP. So people don't like to let go of a category name. And workload automation was first coined by Gartner in 2012, or in 2005, I'm sorry, when they quit using job scheduling. But by 2012, they sort of stopped covering this category in the quadrant. But the workload automation name we've continued to use. It's clearly getting dated, but I just haven't seen enough reason to quit using it. So that's the more complicated answer. It is substantially the same for those products that are the most aggressively moving towards the future. And it probably is leaving behind some of the more point-specific products. And when the radar comes out in September, if you follow that, you'll get a breakdown of, you know, who's in which camp or which category.
Thank you for that clarification, Dan. The next question is, since RPAs are broadening their capabilities over the last couple of years, how do you differentiate RPA and WLA?
Interesting question. I haven't plugged into RPA as much recently as I should. When I first plugged into it, attended a few conferences, it's sort of a point solution for a frustrated end user or a frustrated organization who doesn't yet have their digital transformation. I know it's morphing into other things. I know they're bringing AI into it, but a lot of times it's a very task specific thing. It can create great value for organizations to do it, but there isn't a lot of the other integration with the RPA tools, and that may be growing, or it may not need to grow because of the marriage with workload automation. And as I said, every single vendor I think that I've scored so far for the radar has increased their RPA involvement in the last 2 years. So clearly there's probably less need to develop those tools in that direction. But as they were first implemented, they're very focused on the task and not focused on, is there scheduling or coordination around that? Is there communication needs? Are there dependencies and predecessors? In fact, are there some things the RPA function shouldn't run against until maybe a job that's orchestrated or run by a workload tool that needs to finish? I mean, without any kind of connectivity there, you might just try to run your RPA thing, but all the data you need may not be there because some other job that workload automation is coordinating hasn't yet completed. So, connecting the dots on end-to-end processes and wrapping RPA into the fold is helpful. Those tools traditionally didn't have those kinds of capabilities. And then also RPA is not often linked to SLA policies and that awareness of SLAs, where workload has been doing that a long time. So you could build that capability into RPA, or if you orchestrate RPA with workload, now you can bring the Teams and Slack kind of ticketing connectivity workload has to the party. You bring the SLA policy awareness to the party. So there's certainly overlap between the two tools, but I think the organizations that are having the most success are using RPA in the task-oriented way and then making it more aware and more integrated by orchestrating it with workload.
Good insights. Thanks, Dan. The next question is, it seems that most enterprise SaaS solutions are now object-oriented and utilize REST APIs. Do you agree?
Well, the integration is a big deal, and the REST API is certainly sort of the primary method. I know there's some new thoughts on some new types of API things that are starting to bubble up, but yeah, that is primary. And we went through a period of time. If you look back 10 or 12 years, everybody looked to the workload vendor to give the integrations to support the applications that they wanted to support. And if you were using an app that wasn't supported by the tool you had, you could think about a different tool, or you could press your vendor to add it. You might be able to code it your own, but it might not have been as easy. With the proliferation of REST APIs, we certainly went through a period where a lot of the vendors created the capability for organizations to create their own integrations, and that is great. And that was the fad, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, and it's still ongoing. But what seemed to start happening about 2 years ago, maybe, and is still happening, is if you build it yourself, it's still not part of the vendor's testing. It's still not part of their change management. And there was almost a resurgence of, yeah, great, I can do it myself, but big key apps, I still would prefer the vendor to provide it. So that one is kind of ebbed and flowed a bit. That may not be quite on point to the question. It may have been more about cloud. And certainly every major tool lets you build your own integrations now. And I know a lot of organizations are leveraging that. But when you take something like, S/4HANA with SAP, I need a deep integration. That's the kind of thing that you're probably better off still getting it from the vendor. And a lot of the products have gone way deep on and really increased their SAP capabilities. So it's both, right? Some I'm going to get from the vendor, and some of the key ones are the really complicated ones that everybody needs. I'd almost rather they do it so that I know it's going to be part of their change management and patch management going forward. But for the ones I need, I have complete freedom to do it with tools that are being provided by the various products to give you that capability.
Thanks, Dan. Let's take one final question. This attendee wants to know if there's going to be an EMA radar report for workload automation coming soon, or is the category expired?
Wow, the category is far from expired. I think it's gotten way more important given all of the things we've talked about in terms of the technology. So absolutely, the category is increasing in importance. And yes, I've kind of alluded to it several times, but I kicked the process off with all of the vendors back in maybe 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago. We started looking through the survey I asked them to fill out. Each product fills out, and they all contribute to adding all of the new capabilities, because as I tell all of them, if I don't measure it, you're not going to get credit for it. And we did that process. Then they've had the last 4 weeks to complete that. I've got the bulk of them back. There's a few more I'm waiting on, but I'm actively in the process. In fact, just yesterday morning, I interviewed my first of what will be 30 to 40 users of these products over the course of doing the radar. So it's well underway. It will remain underway through August. I hope to have it published in September. Sometimes the review process with the various vendors can move my timeline out by a couple of weeks. So I haven't declared a specific publish date. My goal is early September. That might spill into late September, but I think it will be in that September timeframe.
Thanks, Dan. And I wanted to thank our audience for joining us today. As I mentioned at the start of the event, you will be receiving a follow-up email from EMA with the on-demand playback of today's webinar. So be sure to check that email out. And I hope we'll see you at a future EMA research webinar. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.